Kneel down and pour her some wine. At least you should be able to do that.
Ethan said it so casually that it sounded as if he had just asked someone to pass him a napkin. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in amused laughter. Some people exchanged glances as though they were witnessing a rare form of entertainment, while others openly enjoyed the humiliation of the woman standing frozen in the middle of the living room. Sophia felt as though her feet were nailed to the floor. The tray in her hands trembled slightly. In front of her, Vanessa wrapped her arm around Ethan and rested her head on his shoulder with an undisguised smile of triumph. She looked Sophia up and down before slowly raising her wine glass.
Listen to him. We shouldn't make the guests uncomfortable.
A few more laughs echoed through the room. Sophia looked at the husband she had loved for 10 years. The man she had worked 2 jobs to help through the difficult days of building his business. The man who had once held her hand and promised he would never let anyone hurt her. But now he was the one leading the humiliation. Ethan did not avoid her gaze. Instead, he smirked and added, "Don't stand there looking at me as if you're the victim, if you knew how to keep a man from leaving." None of this would have happened. The room filled with whispers. Sophia felt her throat tighten. The most painful part was not Vanessa, nor was it the people laughing at her. The most painful part was that the man standing in front of her knew exactly what he was doing. He knew she would be hurt. He knew she would be humiliated, and he chose to do it anyway. At that moment, Sophia thought it was the worst day of her life. She thought she would always remember those laughs, those looks, and the feeling of being replaced inside her own home. But she had no idea that life still had another chapter waiting ahead. 3 years later, the woman smiling triumphantly beside Ethan that day appeared on every local news broadcast. No more expensive dresses, no more luxurious parties, no more arrogance that made her believe she had won. Vanessa was escorted out of a luxury hotel by police in front of dozens of reporters. Camera flashes went off continuously. Questions came from every direction, and what surprised many people most was that the first names signed on the complaint in the investigation file was not a business partner, not an investor, but Sophia. Some people think power gives them the right to humiliate others. They believe that as long as they have money, status, or the admiration of the crowd, they can trample on someone else's dignity without paying a price. They think the pain they cause will eventually be forgotten with time. But life always has its own way of collecting debts like these. Not immediately, not the next day, but certainly at a moment they least expect. Because when betrayal becomes a habit, collapse becomes only a matter of time. And this is the story of Sophia. A woman who lost everything in a single night was pushed to the depths of humiliation by the man she loved most, before making those who once laughed at her wish they had never met her. 12 years earlier, when Ethan was still a sales employee, earning just enough to pay the rent on a small apartment at the end of the street, no one believed he would build a successful company, except Sophia. During the early years of their marriage, while their friends were buying houses, buying cars, and building more stable lives, Sophia remained patiently by her husband's side. She gave up the job she loved to support Ethan full-time. During the day, she handled paperwork, answered client emails, and managed the books for his young company at night. She stayed up late with him reviewing contracts, calculating costs, and planning for the next day. There were months when the company struggled, and Sophia quietly sold the only jewelry her mother had left her so Ethan could pay his employees. But whenever Ethan asked why she was always willing to sacrifice so much, Sophia would simply smile and say, "Because I believe in you," and she truly did. She believed that if they worked hard together, they would have a good future. But money can change many things. As the company began to grow, Ethan gradually became a different person. At first, it was only meetings that lasted longer than usual. Then came the constant business trips. Then the dinners where he came home irritated whenever Sophia tried to start a conversation. The man who once thanked her for every little thing began to treat her sacrifices as something ordinary. As the company became more successful, Ethan also became increasingly accustomed to being admired by others. The compliments changed him. The parties with the upper class made him forget where he had come from. And the first person he began to look down on was the woman who had stood beside him during his hardest days. Sophia noticed the change but kept trying to convince herself that it was only work pressure. She did not know that someone else had entered Ethan's life. Vanessa entered the company like a fresh breeze. She was nearly 10 years younger than Sophia, always appeared in expensive dresses, and knew exactly what to say to attract men's attention. Vanessa enjoyed making other people jealous. She enjoyed walking into a room and drawing every eye toward herself. But what interested her even more was seeing Sophia. From their very first meeting, Vanessa viewed Sophia as an outdated obstacle that deserved to be removed. At a company party, when Sophia appeared wearing a simple dress she had worn many times before, Vanessa let out a small laugh and spoke loudly enough for those around her to hear, "You look more like his babysitter than his wife." Some people tried to pretend they hadn't heard it, but others laughed along. Sophia felt her face burn. She intended to ignore it as she always did. But Vanessa didn't stop. She looked at Sophia's clothes and shook her head with exaggerated pity. "If I were you, I wouldn't wear something that cheap to places like this." The atmosphere around them became awkward. Many people waited for Ethan to defend his wife after all. Sophia had stood beside him for 12 years, but Ethan simply took a sip of wine and looked Sophia up and down. Then he said something that made her heart drop into an abyss. "You should learn from Vanessa how to take care of yourself." Sophia froze, not because the remark was especially cruel, but because it came from the very man who once said he loved her for her sincerity and simplicity. Vanessa smiled triumphantly. Ethan continued talking with her as though nothing had happened, and for the first time in many years, Sophia began to feel that she was no longer the beloved wife in this marriage. She felt more like an old piece of furniture left in a corner than the woman who had helped build everything Ethan had today. Sophia kept trying to convince herself that things would eventually be fine. Even though Ethan grew more distant, even though Vanessa appeared more and more frequently in his conversations, she still believed that 12 years of marriage could not be replaced so easily. She was wrong. Everything collapsed on a rainy evening. Sophia was preparing dinner when she heard a car stop outside. She wiped her hands and walked into the living room, hoping Ethan had come home early like he used to. But when the door opened, Ethan did not walk in alone. Vanessa came in beside him, carrying a large suitcase. She looked around the house with the eyes of someone inspecting her new property. Sophia stood frozen. She looked at the suitcase, then at Ethan. A feeling of dread rose inside her. "What's going on?" she asked. Ethan set his keys on the table and replied in a frighteningly indifferent tone. "She's going to live here from now on." Sophia thought she had heard him wrong. She laughed reflexively because she assumed it was a tasteless joke, but no one laughed with her. Vanessa rolled her suitcase into the middle of the living room. Ethan took off his coat and sat down as though he had just announced something completely ordinary. "What did you say?" Sophia asked again. Ethan looked up at his wife. "I said, Vanessa is going to live here from now on." The whole world around, Sophia seemed to stop for a few seconds. She looked at the man in front of her and no longer recognized him. The man who had held her hand on their wedding day was now bringing his mistress to live in the very home they had built together. But something even more painful was still to come. Vanessa sat down and smiled. Ethan turned to Sophia and said something she could hardly believe. "Bring us some tea." Sophia stood motionless. Ethan frowned. "Didn't you hear me?" Vanessa leaned back in her chair and said in a sweet, mocking voice, "Maybe she's not used to having another person in the house." Ethan laughed. "She'll get used to it that night." Sophia did not sleep. She sat alone in her room, hoping that by morning Ethan would realize he had gone too far. But the next morning, the first thing she heard was Vanessa's voice from downstairs. "This room is too small. I want a bigger one." Ethan did not object. He walked into Sophia's room and spoke as though giving an order. "Give Vanessa your room." Sophia stared at him. "That's our room." Ethan shrugged. Not anymore. Every day that followed felt like a never-ending nightmare. Vanessa walked through the house as though she were the true owner. She rearranged furniture, gave orders to the staff, and constantly treated Sophia like an unwanted guest. But what hurt Sophia the most was that Ethan never once stopped her. On the contrary, he seemed to enjoy the sense of power that Sophia's patience gave him. Then one weekend evening, Ethan decided to do something Sophia would never forget. He hosted a large party at the house. Friends, business partners, and acquaintances from the business world arrived one after another. Sophia intended to stay upstairs to avoid the curious stares. But Ethan called her downstairs. "Come down, everyone wants to see you." When Sophia entered the living room, she felt dozens of eyes on her. Vanessa sat close beside Ethan with a victorious smile on her lips. The atmosphere was tense. Then Ethan stood and raised his wine glass. He looked at Sophia first, then at Vanessa. After that, he smiled. "I'd like to introduce everyone to the two most important women in my life." The room fell silent. Sophia felt her heart pounding. But Ethan's next sentence crushed everything that remained inside her. He pointed toward Sophia. "This is the woman I used to love." Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan turned toward Vanessa and smiled with complete satisfaction. "And this is the woman I actually want to be with." The room erupted in awkward laughter. Some people lowered their heads to avoid Sophia's eyes. Others pretended to raise their glasses to hide their discomfort, but Vanessa laughed loudly. She wrapped herself around Ethan's arm as though she had just won some kind of competition. Sophia stood there, feeling as though her entire dignity had been dragged into the middle of a crowd for entertainment. That was the moment she realized the man in front of her no longer had any respect for her. A few days later, while Ethan was at work, Vanessa decided to end everything in the cruelest way possible. She dragged all of Sophia's clothes and personal belongings out of the room. Every dress, every book, every photograph was thrown into the yard like garbage. When Ethan returned home, Sophia was still kneeling on the ground, gathering her belongings. She looked at her husband with one final hope that he would stop it. But Ethan simply stood there, silent, no objection. No anger, no protection. That silence killed their marriage. That evening, Sophia pulled her old suitcase out of the house. No money, no home, nowhere to go. Not a single relative appeared. No one stood by her side. After 12 years of sacrificing for others, all she carried with her were a few sets of clothes and a broken heart. But that same night, as the door closed behind her, Sophia had no idea that it was not the end of her life. It was only the last day of the woman who had once accepted being trampled on. The first few weeks after being thrown out of the house nearly broke Sophia. Not because she no longer had money, not because of the cramped rented room with damp walls and an old bed. What hurt the most was the feeling that she had spent 12 years of her life loving the wrong person. There were nights when Sophia stayed awake until dawn, sitting on the cold floor with her head in her hands, asking herself what she had done wrong. She had stood beside Ethan from the days when he had nothing. She had given up the job she loved to help him build his company. She had sacrificed her own opportunities so that he could pursue his ambitions. But in the end, that man did not just betray her. He turned her into a joke in front of strangers. The most painful thing was not losing her husband. The most painful thing was realizing that the person she loved had never truly appreciated everything she had sacrificed. There were days when Sophia worked from early morning until late at night. She took any job that could earn her money. She worked until her hands went numb and her eyes turned red from lack of sleep, because if she stopped, she would have to face the memories she was trying so hard to forget. And yet life is sometimes very strange. During those darkest days, Sophia discovered a truth she had never realized throughout 12 years of marriage one evening. While organizing old boxes of documents she had brought from the house she once lived in, she accidentally opened a dust-covered file. Inside were hundreds of pages of business plans, market reports, and company growth strategies. Sophia turned page after page and slowly fell silent. Every single document had been written by her years earlier, the business plans that had helped the company secure its first clients. The expansion ideas Ethan had presented to investors, the strategies that had transformed a small business into a multi-million-dollar company. For years, Sophia had always believed she was simply helping her husband. But now she realized a far more painful truth. Much of Ethan's success had actually been built on her work. He received all the praise. He stood on stage, accepting awards. He appeared in newspapers as a brilliant entrepreneur. While the person who had stayed awake all night building the foundation had never even been mentioned. Sophia sat quietly for hours, not because she was angry, but because for the first time in her life, she saw her own value. Not long afterward, a man named Robert contacted her. He was a lawyer who had worked with Ethan's company during its early years. After hearing Sophia's story, he placed a file in front of her and said, "I think it's time you knew the truth." Sophia opened the file and froze. Inside were countless emails, meeting records, and legal documents proving that many of the company's key intellectual assets had originally been built from plans she had personally created. Robert looked at her and continued slowly. Ethan always appeared to be the one who created everything, but the people who were there from the beginning all know how much you contributed. Those words caught in Sophia's throat. For years, she had been seen as a woman living off her husband's success, but the truth was exactly the opposite. A few months later, an investor who had once worked with Ethan also came to see her. He still remembered the meetings years ago when Sophia had been the only person able to come up with solutions that saved the company from bankruptcy. After several conversations, he decided to invest in her new business venture. For the first time in many years, someone saw Sophia's true abilities instead of viewing her as a shadow standing behind a man. And for the first time, Sophia decided to build something for herself. The years that followed were filled with work, determination, and ambition that she had once been forced to bury. Sophia's company grew faster than anyone had predicted. She became one of the most talked about female entrepreneurs in the industry. Business magazines began writing about her. Partnership offers arrived constantly, but what satisfied Sophia most was not the money or the fame. It was the fact that she no longer had to ask anyone to recognize her worth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the first cracks had begun to appear in the life Ethan had once been so proud of. While expanding her business, Sophia accidentally gained access to many documents related to her former company. The more she investigated, the more suspicious transactions she discovered. Money that had disappeared without a trace, secret accounts, contracts that had been altered in unusual ways. And the name that appeared most often in all those transactions was Vanessa. After months of quietly investigating, Sophia discovered that Vanessa had embezzled an enormous amount of money from the company over many years. But what was even more shocking was that Ethan knew everything. He did not report it. He did not stop it. He did not correct it. He chose to hide everything in order to protect the woman he had once brought into his home to humiliate his wife. Sophia looked at the evidence before her and for the first time understood that Ethan's downfall would not begin with competitors or the market. It would begin with the very choices he had stubbornly protected for years. 3 years later, Sophia's name appeared in the same business magazines that Ethan had once dreamed of appearing on the cover of. People spoke of her as one of the fastest-growing female entrepreneurs in the industry. Major conferences invited her to speak as a keynote speaker. Business partners who had once viewed her as the shadow behind Ethan now had to schedule meetings weeks in advance just for a chance to see her. But what surprised many people most was not the speed of Sophia's success. It was the fact that she never once mentioned Ethan in any interview. She did not talk about the failed marriage. She did not talk about the betrayal. She did not talk about the woman who had taken over her home. Sophia built her new life the only way she knew how, by continuing to move forward. Meanwhile, Ethan's life resembled a building collapsing one floor at a time. Debts began to appear after a series of bad decisions. The investors who had once raised glasses to celebrate him at lavish parties no longer answered his calls. The people who once called him a business genius quietly began to withdraw. Every week, more employees submitted resignation letters. Fewer and fewer people attended meetings. The offices that had once been full of activity became frighteningly empty. But Ethan kept convincing himself that everything was temporary. He believed that if he could just survive this difficult period, everything would return to normal. He had no idea that the person about to destroy him was not a competitor. It was the very woman he had chosen to replace Sophia. Vanessa began disappearing for days at a time, offering increasingly ridiculous excuses. Sometimes she claimed she was traveling for business. Sometimes she said she was meeting partners. Sometimes she simply did not bother to explain. Ethan was too busy trying to save the company to be suspicious. Until one morning, when the accounting department discovered that large amounts of money had disappeared from the system. At first, Ethan assumed it was a mistake, but the more he investigated, the colder he felt. Transfers that had been taking place for years, secret accounts registered under other people's names. Fake contracts created solely to siphon money out of the company. And at the end of nearly every transaction, Vanessa's name appeared like a knife driven straight into what remained of his pride. Ethan rushed home to find her, but Vanessa was gone. The closet was empty. Her passport had disappeared. Her phone account had been cancelled. The woman who had once claimed to love him more than life itself had taken millions of dollars and vanished without a trace. On the marble table in the living room, only a short note remained. I don't want to sink with a sinking ship. Ethan sat down. His hands trembled. And for the first time in many years, he understood what it felt like to be left behind. But that was only the beginning. While Ethan struggled to patch the holes appearing everywhere around him, Sophia had completed the final part of her work. For months, she quietly gathered evidence, not out of jealousy, not out of hatred, but because every time she looked at those documents, she remembered the night she had been thrown out of her home. She remembered Vanessa's laughter. She remembered Ethan's indifferent expression as her clothes were thrown into the yard like garbage. And she remembered the feeling of helplessness when not a single person stood by her side. Now dozens of thick files sat on Sophia's desk. Bank records, fraudulent contracts, internal emails, transaction statements, evidence that Ethan had tried to bury for years. Robert flipped through the files before looking up at her. Once this is filed, there's no turning back. Sophia looked out through the glass window. The city below was still glowing with lights as it did every day. She remembered the woman she had once been. Kneeling in the yard, collecting her clothes whilst the husband she loved stood there without saying a word. Then she turned back, the day he decided to humiliate me in front of everyone. He chose this path himself. 1 week later, investigators officially opened the case. Accounts were frozen. Financial records were audited. People who had remained silent began giving statements. The news spread quickly throughout the city. Ethan nearly lost his mind when he found out. He called lawyers. He called business partners. He called anyone who might help him. But for the first time in his life, no one wanted to stand beside him anymore. Then he heard Sophia's name mentioned in the investigation. Suddenly, everything became clear. 2 days later, Ethan appeared at her office. No luxury car, no team of assistants following behind him, no trace of the man who had once believed he could do anything without consequences. He sat outside her office waiting for nearly 4 hours. Just as Sophia had once sat, waiting outside her own living room, hoping for a little respect. When the door finally opened, Ethan walked in with a face so exhausted it was difficult to recognize him. He looked at Sophia for a long time before speaking. "Please help me this time." Sophia did not answer immediately. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a thick file. It was not the investigation file. It was the company's very first business plans, the documents she had written with her own hands many years earlier. Sophia placed them on the desk and pushed them toward him. "The day you made me serve your mistress." Ethan lowered his head. "The day you stood in front of your friends and said she was the woman you truly wanted to be with." Sophia's voice remained frighteningly calm. "You thought I had no value." Ethan could not bring himself to look up. Sophia opened the file. Page after page of old documents appeared before him. Market expansion plans, customer development strategies. Ideas that had helped the company survive its most difficult years. Every page carried Sophia's handwriting. but you never knew who laid the foundation for everything you had. Ethan turned the pages one by one. His face gradually grew pale. For the first time in his life, he saw the full truth he had deliberately ignored for years. What he called success had never belonged solely to him. And the woman he had once considered useless was the very person who had helped him build everything from nothing. Ethan sat speechless because at last he understood that the most valuable thing he had lost was not the company, not the money, not the status, but the woman who had loved him when he had nothing. What happened afterward moved faster than anyone expected. Only a few weeks after investigators became involved, Vanessa's name appeared on every local news broadcast. The woman who had once walked into Sophia's house with a triumphant smile was now being escorted out of a luxury hotel in front of dozens of reporters. No more expensive dresses, no more extravagant parties, no more smug, mocking remarks, only a woman trying to hide her face from television cameras as evidence of embezzlement was revealed piece by piece. At the same time, Ethan's company officially collapsed. The last investors withdrew. Loans were called in. Business partners who once called him a friend disappeared almost overnight. The mansion from which Sophia had once been thrown out was put up for auction to pay off debts. On the day of the auction, Ethan stood across the street, watching item after item being loaded onto moving trucks. The dining table where he had publicly humiliated his wife. The chair where Vanessa had once sat laughing in Sophia's face. The entire house that had once filled him with pride no longer belonged to him for the first time in his life. Ethan understood what it felt like to lose everything, not losing money, not losing a company, but the feeling of watching everything he once believed would belong to him forever disappear one piece at a time, while being powerless to stop it. In the months that followed, Ethan searched for work. He sent applications to dozens of companies, but the reputation of the scandal had reached them before he did. No one wanted to hire a man who was under investigation and appearing in the headlines. Again and again, Ethan received rejection emails, until one day he saw a job opening at a large corporation that was expanding its operations. The salary was enough to help him start his life over. After spending hours preparing, Ethan submitted his application with the last bit of hope he had left. A week later, he was invited to the final interview. For the first time in months, Ethan felt that perhaps his future was not completely over. But when he walked into the conference room, he froze. The person sitting at the head of the table was none other than Sophia. No longer the woman dragging a suitcase away from her home in tears. No longer the wife who always tried to please him. Sophia was now one of the corporation's major shareholders. Ethan felt his throat go dry. He had never imagined that life would bring them together again like this. The interview ended quickly. Sophia barely asked any questions. She simply reviewed his file and then set it down on the table. Ethan knew everything was over before she even spoke. He lowered his head and said in a hoarse voice, "Sophia, I know I don't deserve to ask for anything anymore, but I really need this opportunity." The room fell silent. Sophia looked at the man sitting before her, the man who had kept her awake for years, the man who had stood by while his mistress threw her clothes into the yard. The man who had told his friends that she was no longer the woman he wanted to be with. But strangely, she no longer felt hatred. She looked at him the way she would look at a stranger. Sophia signed the document and slid it across the table toward Ethan. It was a rejection notice. Ethan looked down at the words in front of him. His hand trembled. Sophia slowly stood up. "The day I needed compassion." Ethan closed his eyes. She continued in a calm voice. "You chose cruelty. There was no anger, no shouting. That calmness made everything far more painful." Sophia looked directly into his eyes one final time. "Today I choose justice." Ethan lowered his head. He had nothing left to say, because deep down he knew she was right. What was happening was not revenge. It was the consequence of the choices he had made with his own hands. A few minutes later, Sophia walked out of the building. The light of the setting sun reflected across the towering glass windows. She did not look back. She did not look to see what Ethan was doing. She no longer waited for an apology. That chapter of her life had ended a long time ago, and this time it truly closed for good. The most painful thing is not when a good person takes revenge. The most painful thing is when a bad person is finally forced to live with the consequences of their own actions. If you were Sophia, would you forgive Ethan or let him face every consequence he created for himself? And if this story made you think, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.